Well, we have been, over the last few weeks, talking about what it means to be the church, talking about what it means to do life together. And we started off by talking about the fact that being the church is about being community gathered by Jesus, in Jesus' name. We're not here simply because we like one another. We're here because Jesus has brought us together. That's part of what Jesus did on the cross, is He made us into one family. And as a result of being one family, there's this call to live life together. And so we talked a few weeks ago about listening and the call to be those who are deeply involved in listening to one another, that we make it a priority to be those who hear first and speak second. If you remember the verse we shared from James, it said, "Let everyone be quick to listen and slow to speak and slow to become angry." So I hope you all have been working on that. Y'all been practicing listening over the last few weeks? Chuckles. That's not a good sign. All right. Let's be listeners. Let's practice that. That is the foundation for all that comes after it. We talked then about serving each other, and we said, well, we can't really serve each other until we've listened, right? We can't know how to be a blessing and be caring for the needs of the people around us if we haven't first listened to each other. And in the same way, today we're going to talk about bearing one another's burdens, and that begins with listening as well. If we're going to help carry TJ's textbooks, boy, I hope he doesn't have to carry all those books to school that Holly was using for the children's time here. But if we're going to help each other, we have to begin in that place of listening. And so, here's your first sermon note. Living in Christ-centered community requires that we listen and that we serve one another. And so, my hope is that you've grown in these areas, but this is what we've talked about over the last few weeks, and that you've been practicing this. If you haven't been practicing it, well, I'll give it to you for your homework again. Practice listening, practice serving. And let's be growing in these areas, because it doesn't really make a whole lot of difference if we talk about them on Sunday morning, but we don't actually live them out in the week as we go through our days outside of Sunday. All right, so in addition to listening and to serving one another, we are called to come alongside one another and support each other in the challenges that we face. We use this term in the church sometimes, bearing one another's burdens, and this is what it means. That we're coming alongside each other, and we're living life together, and we're helping one another as we go through the challenges of life. It can be easy to be those who are doing life together when it's fun, life together when it's easy, when we're celebrating the good things in life. But to truly be the church, we have to come alongside one another in the challenges of life as well. And so the question I have for you here is, who then is God calling you to come alongside? As you listen to this message, I want you to be listening with one ear towards God in this time and asking God, okay, God, who am I called to walk with? Whose burdens am I called to bear? Because as a theory, this is nice, but we're actually called to live it out. And so there needs to be someone specific or multiple people who you are actually called to do this with. It doesn't do a whole lot of good for any of us if this is just a theory. We're going to read this morning from Galatians. And Galatians is a book written by the Apostle Paul to the church in a place called Galatia. And we're reading from Galatians chapter 6, which is at the end of this letter. And Paul is kind of trying to get in all of his final instructions before he finishes the letter. I kind of got the sense that he's running out of time and he's got to get it all down real quick. So we'll see what Paul has to say to us here in Galatians 6. I invite you to follow along here beginning in verse 1. Paul writes this, "Brothers and sisters, if a person is caught doing something wrong, you who are spiritual should restore someone like this with a spirit of gentleness. Watch out for yourselves so you won't be tempted too. Carry each other's burdens and so you will fulfill the law of Christ. If anyone thinks they are important when they aren't, they're fooling themselves. So each person should test their own work and be happy with doing a good job and not compare themselves with each other's. Each person will have to carry their own load. So those who are taught the word should share all good things with their teacher. Make no mistake, God is not mocked. A person will harvest what they plant, and those who plant only for their own benefit will harvest devastation. It's a strong word, isn't it? Harvest devastation from their selfishness. But those who plant for the benefit of the Spirit will harvest eternal life from the Spirit. Let's not get tired of doing good, because in time we will harvest. We'll have a harvest if we don't give up. So then, let's work for the good of all, whenever we have an opportunity, and especially those in the household of faith. You may have caught this verse as we read it in verse 2 here. Carry each other's burdens, and so you will fulfill the law of Christ. Now, a burden is simply this. It's anything that drags you down. It can be a physical burden, like Holly shared with us here. We've got the physical weight of textbooks up here that the kids were trying to lift and carry. And that's a burden, isn't it? But often in our lives, if we're carrying a burden, it's more of a metaphor. The weight that's on our shoulders is not usually a heavy load in a physical sense, but it's usually the challenges of life. It's usually the stresses of life. It might have to do with money. It might have to do with family. It might have to do with grief. It might have to do with hard decisions that you have to make, or broken relationships. I'm sure you all could come up with a long list of things that you have seen become burdens for people. You may have heard that saying, it looks like she's got the weight of the world on her shoulders. Y'all ever seen somebody like that? It just looks like they're just so weighed down. And part of being the church is that we're invited to carry those burdens with each other. Paul says, by doing this, you will fulfill the law of Christ. Now, just a few verses before our reading began today, Galatians chapter 5, Paul said that all of the law has been fulfilled in a single statement: love your neighbor as yourself. So that's the law that Paul is talking about, the law that we love one another as we love ourselves. And we fulfill that law, that instruction, that teaching of Jesus Christ when we come alongside each other, when we're bearing those burdens, when we're weighted down with the challenges of life, and help one another. And so, again, I want you to have one ear listening to me and one ear listening to God today, as God is telling you who you need to be helping with this. So the question is, who do you know who is carrying heavy burdens? When you think about that statement, it looks like he's got the weight of the world on his shoulders. Who does that come to mind for you? Maybe God is inviting you to walk with that person and to bear their burdens. The next line in Galatians 6 is kind of a strange one, because Paul's talking about carrying burdens, and the next thing that he says is, if anyone thinks they are important when they aren't, they're fooling themselves. And you think at first, well, what's that got to do with bearing burdens? But the reality is it has everything to do with bearing burdens, because, and this is your next sermon note, we get caught in thinking, well, maybe I'm a little too important to step down and help that person with their burdens. Maybe what I'm doing is a little too important for me to stop and help someone else with that load that they're carrying. As I was working on this sermon this week, I had this happen to me in a very, very powerful way. I was on my computer and I was reading some commentaries about this passage, and so I'm looking at the Greek words and what they mean in the context and when this was originally written, and reading all this kind of technical stuff, and it was a little bit dense. So I flipped over to my Facebook page, which I want to do, and the other multitaskers that involve Facebook and y'all can admit to it, it's all right. Honest place here. So I flipped over to Facebook, and the top post on my feed said this. Let me read it to you so I don't get it wrong. It said this: for those unaware, this week is Infant Loss Awareness Week. In remembrance of our little butterfly, though your time with us was short, we will carry you with us forever and always. And underneath that was a picture of a college friend of mine leaning over her baby daughter in a stroller. And this little girl is obviously very sick. She's got a tube in her nose. And my friend is smiling at this little girl who I didn't realize until that point had died. She's about 1 year old in the picture. And I start tearing up. And I just make a comment on there and said, I'm crying with you. Thank you for sharing this. And then I went back to my important work, right? Because I've got important work to do. I've got to prepare this sermon, and I've got to be sure that I'm understanding the passage just right, and I need to be sure I got the meaning of these Greek words. And so I flip back over to my Bible commentary, and I'm trying to read, and my Greek is not real great, to be honest with you. I'm trying to read the Greek, and I've got tears welling up in my eyes, and I'm getting annoyed at these tears in my eyes because I can't see the page because I'm crying. And then I realize what I'm doing. My task had become too important to simply stop and bear that burden with my friend. So I stopped reading my commentary and just cried for a little bit. Wasn't anything I could do. This wasn't a burden that I was going to be able to fix. But sometimes that's what bearing burdens is about. It's just about being with one another in the midst of our pain. Now, I'm a typical male in this. I like to fix problems. Do we have any other fixers out there? If there's a problem, if they've got a weight or burden, you want to fix it. I want to tell you today, you can't always fix it. And sometimes just being present, being with somebody in the midst of that crushing weight is more than enough. I remember very clearly the first time that I got called to the hospital when somebody had passed away. It was in seminary, and Joy and I were on call for the pastor at the church where we were interning because the pastor was away doing something. And we got a call that the husband of a very active member in the church had died having his pacemaker battery changed. It just isn't supposed to happen. Supposed to be kind of normal routine, and so we rushed down to the hospital thinking, what are we going to do? How are we going to bear this burden? And we go into the hospital room where they are, and it's the operating room, and we haven't really been in that situation very much, and so we just kind of stood there. We gave her a hug, told her how sorry we were. They just kind of stood there while the family grieved. We were there an hour, 2 hours. I really don't know how long. And as the family started to disperse, we left too and walked out thinking, boy, we didn't do much. We didn't really help much. But as we talked to the family later on, they came up to us and they said, thank you so much. Thank you so much for bearing that burden with us. Thank you so much. And then I'm thinking, I didn't do anything. I wanted to fix something. There was nothing I could fix. But simply being present allowed us to help them bear that burden. Now, didn't mean they weren't going to grieve for a long time. But they knew someone was there with them. And I'll be honest, that's not just my job as a pastor. This is our job as the Church of Jesus Christ, that we bear one another's burdens. We can't be too important for that. Our tasks can't be too important for that. The other thing that sometimes happens when we think about bearing the burdens of people around us is that we get hung up on, well, who's bearing my burdens with me? And we start thinking about, well, how are the other people helping me? You know, I've got problems. Newsflash, join the club. All right? We all have struggles in our lives, and if our only thought is, who's going to bear my burdens, then we end up in this place of selfish living. It's not going to get us where we want to go. This is the comment that Paul makes. He said, selfish living leads to devastation. And the first time I read that, I thought, wow, that is a strong word. But when we think about this call to bear one another's burdens, that's exactly true. If we are only focused on how other people can help us, we are going to be devastated at the end of the day because there's not going to be a whole lot of community built up around simply our selfish desires. But, Paul says, if we continue to do good, we will harvest true community. This life together that we're longing to create. We continue to do good. And I'll be the first to tell you, that is not always easy. I suspect we all know somebody who's got a lot of burdens in their lives. And they don't go away. And we may come alongside them for a time and we think, wow, this burden is really heavy. I don't know that I can keep carrying this with you. But this is the beauty of being the church. Each one of us should not have to bear the load of caring for another person by ourselves. If any of you have ever been a caregiver for a parent or a sibling or a spouse, you know what a heavy weight that is. If we are able to be the church together, then no one person has to bear that. And that's my call for us today as we think about what it means to be the church. The book of Hebrews gives an interesting picture of what this looks like. And I want to read to you from Hebrews chapter 10. This is starting in verse 32. Hebrews says this. It says, remember the earlier days after you saw the light. You stood your ground while you were suffering from an enormous amount of pressure. Sometimes you were exposed to insults and abuse in public. Other times you became partners with those who were treated that way. If you even showed sympathy towards people in prison, and accepted the confiscation of your possessions with joy, since you knew that you had better and lasting possessions. So don't throw away your confidence. It brings a great reward. The church there was being persecuted. And when one person was arrested, The rest of the church stood with them. They knew that that might mean that their possessions were confiscated. They knew it might mean that they themselves would get thrown in prison or that they would lose their positions in society and all these things. But they said, you know what? There are more important things. We're going to bear this burden. We're going to be the church. And I love the way this passage ends. Don't throw away your confidence. It brings a great reward. Continue in what you're doing. Your next sermon note is this. And you can see how this happened for the people in Hebrews. Walking with one another will cost. It will cost time. It will cost money. It will cost resources. For those of you who've done this, you know. You know that there's a cost. The question is, are you willing to pay that cost in order to be the community that God has called us to be? Are we willing to do that? The thing is, bearing one another's burdens is really a test of true community. It's easy to be the community when things are fun, things are easy. It's nice to have a potluck, or gather for a meal, or celebrate an accomplishment. It's good to have a party. Who doesn't want to come to a party, right? But when challenges come up, that is the test of whether we really are the community of God, whether we really are the people that God is calling us to be. As I was working on this message, a song came to mind. I want to share a little bit of it with you. It's a Tim McGraw and Tracy Lawrence song. You find out who your friends are. And I think it really paints a pretty good picture of the challenge of truly being the community God wants us to be. Let's listen to a little bit of this. This ain't where the road comes to an end. This ain't where the bandwagon stops. It's just one of those times when a lot of folks jump off. The question is, are we going to be the folks who jump off? Now, Tim's singing it. He and I are on a first name basis. Tim is singing about for himself, people coming alongside him. I want you to sing those words as if you're the friend who gets the call. Is this one of those times when you jump off the bandwagon because you realize it's going to cost you? Or are you going to be one of those who is committed to being community together? Committed to being the church together? My hope is that we would figure out how to be those who don't jump off. That we would walk through those dark times together. Because when we do that, we live out the command of Jesus Christ that we love one another as we love ourselves. I want to take a couple minutes and just invite you to think a little bit more on how this applies to you. We started off by saying that this has got to be practical. There's got to be particular people whose burdens we bear. And so we're going to take a couple minutes just to think about this and to listen to what God is saying to us in this. First, who do you know that's weighed down? Who do you know that needs someone to help bear their burdens? And second, how can you do that? How can you do that? Let's go to God in prayer.